up towards 6:47 in Trinidad and Tobago. Well, the discussion on immigration rights will continue, with various sides having their say on the matter. What are the laws governing immigration here in Trinidad and Tobago? Well, we're joined on set by attorney at law Farai Hove Masaisai. And if you're wondering about the origin of the name, his father is Zimbabwean. He's lived for a long time in Zimbabwe, in Bulawayo, to be more precise, where the West Indies actually won a test series last October. That's something to mention. When the West Indies win a test series, that was against Zimbabwe. He's, of course, a practicing attorney at law. His mother is Trinidadian, but he's going to spend a lot of time in Zimbabwe. Thanks very much for joining us. Good to have you.
Thank you very much, Fazir. Thank you for having me on set.
And I know when we're talking about the laws and statutes, it can get very complicated. But I suppose first and foremost, we want to understand, based on what would have happened over the weekend about the deportation of 82 Venezuelans and so on, was that breaking the law?
Okay, I wouldn't say it was breaking our local laws, because now we have to know the difference between the two. There's immigration, and then there's asylum, which goes with refugee status.
Yes.
All right, so immigration is normally governed by the Immigration Act. We have an Immigration Act that governs persons who want to come to Trinidad to seek a better life. Whereas if you are seeking asylum with the end result to be called a refugee, then you are really fleeing some sort of persecution. All right, and we don't have laws to govern that. We have policy, but it's not legislation. We have signed treaties, but we have not enacted it into our legislation. And obviously, if there's no legislation, then it's very difficult to implement something that is not even legislated.
Right.
All right. So we must know the difference.
Yeah.
Immigration and asylum.
Yeah.
So immigration, it would be like persons who are coming here to work, persons who are coming here for residency status and that sort of thing. That will fall under the Immigration Act. Whereas persons who are fleeing, say, I think most of the Venezuelans, they claim to be fleeing political persecution.
Yes.
They say that they cannot hold a different view from the view of the Maduro administration, or else they will be persecuted. So they come to Trinidad to hold their views and hold an independent view. That you are supposed to be protected. There's the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees.
Right.
All right, and their agent in our country is the Living Waters community, and they act on behalf of the United Nations for the processing of persons who would like to be called refugees. So they normally have to go through a process. The process it's a kind of tedious process, but it is a process, and the only agency under the United Nations is the Living Waters community.
And I suppose because these things can be so particular depending on clauses and statutes and what is law, what is policy and so on. As far as our own situation now, I suppose we could argue that our systems and our structures and our laws are now really being tested by this situation. What is your sense as to how we are coping within the existing legal framework and our obligations to either the UN or the international agencies?
I don't think we are coping within the existing legal framework, because when we look at the existing legal framework, we have to look at our constitution. Our constitution guarantees anyone on Trinidad soil liberty, freedom of liberty. All right, so you're not supposed to be unlawfully detained.
Even if you're here illegally?
Even if you're here illegally. All right, there's a Privy Council ruling called Dr. Ndaki. This is Robert Naidiki versus the Attorney General of Trinidad and Tobago. And this is a Privy Council ruling of 2004. All right, and the facts are, I'm going to narrow down the facts. The facts, the doctor came here to work in the Port of Spain General Hospital. He overstayed his time, his work permit expired, but he opened a private practice. He opened the private practice, they did not renew his work permit. They then arrested him, detained him at the Aripo Detention Center for about 2 months. He challenged his detention. He challenged it, he lost in the High Court, he lost in the Court of Appeal, and he won in the Privy Council. And he got compensation on the Constitution. He used the Constitution of Trinidad and Tobago. And the law lords had this to say. They said, quite contrary, unless the immigrant's detention is required for an inquiry, and that's called a special inquiry, to be held forthwith, or for his removal to be effected pursuant to a deportation order, already in force, there seems no sound reason for a power of arrest. So you cannot arrest someone unless you either going to bring them before a special inquiry forthwith, and forthwith doesn't mean tomorrow, it doesn't mean next week, it means
Immediately.
forthwith, immediately. Or you already have a deportation order in your hand, and that doesn't happen unless you have a special inquiry. So it is illegal for any police officer, any immigration officer to just see you at the side of the road, think you're an immigrant, and arrest you.
Well, that's and it's important that you make that point, Mr. Masai, because that is what we are hearing from Venezuelan nationals and other non-nationals. They are saying that now they're just on a whim, they're being picked up, they're being held for questioning. They're being some lady told a story that she was on the beach at Maracas and she was held for a while and had to prove her status and all these sorts of things.
That is illegal, because our highest court is still the Privy Council, and only the Privy Council can overrule the Privy Council.
What recourse do individuals have in this situation?
No, well, in that situation, then you'd probably have to take it to the courts, the constitutional courts of Trinidad and Tobago, because not just because I'm not a Trinidadian national, I'm not protected by the laws of Trinidad. And our highest law is still the Constitution, and it guarantees you liberty. It guarantees you freedom of expression. It guarantees you equality under the law, meaning if you have held me, you must advise me of my right to an attorney. Especially if I speak a different language, you then must speak my language and tell me what is my rights, and that I have the right to be represented by a legal mind.
How would you respond to those who will say that sounds very, very unbalanced, that you are here illegally, you didn't follow due procedure, you are here in the country illegal, you don't speak the language, and I now, as the law enforcement authorities, have to now speak your language, accommodate you, even though you are breaking the law by being here?
Well, it's not necessarily breaking the law per se, because the law is you cannot hold me and detain me unless you have a special inquiry already cordoned off, and that takes a process, so you wouldn't have it. Or you have a deportation order already. Obviously, the Minister of National Security, he has that wide discretion, so he can make a declaration that you are not a permitted entrant.
Right.
But unless the minister makes that declaration, then the police officer or the immigration officer has no right to hold you. And that's our law. It has been there for quite some time. Some people criticize the Immigration Act because they still don't allow imbeciles and idiots into the country. That's
referenced in the law?
That's there. Who are you to say I'm an idiot? In terms of, it's there in the, who is a permitted entrant?
Law the next time I have to
All
come
right,
back
so
in the country,
under section 8 of the Act, it makes for quite humorous reading.
Yes.
Persons who are idiots, who are imbeciles, they don't...
Feeble-minded.
Blind. You know, so the
persons who are dumb, blind, or otherwise physically defective or physically handicapped.
So it's discriminatory, and it's...
So basically you could use this law to keep out people just happen to have a disability.
Correct. And that I'm surprised that wasn't challenged by the gentleman who challenged the other part with homosexuals.
Yes.
You know, because that is there as well.
They're also,
you know, so in any event, blind people, if my child is born blind and I'm bringing him in from Zimbabwe,
they could tell you no.
You know, that they can say, Mr. Masai, I say you could come, but your child is blind.
I mean, and I know this is a broader discussion,
Yes.
but doesn't this, and it's an aside from our discussion, doesn't this show how imperative it is for our laws and our to be upgraded?
Correct.
I mean,
correct.
I mean, to have this as our law, it sounds so insulting.
This is a 1969 act.
Yeah.
Immigration Act, Chapter 1801 of 1969.
Even that sounds backward to me.
Yeah.
That to think that as recently as 1969 they would be thinking like this. I would have thought that was 1869 or 1769 or something.
It's very unfortunate. Since then we have had a Republican Constitution, and there are rights enshrined in the Constitution that I think any judicial officer looking at that would think it's humorous.
But again, as I said, it just merely reinforces how badly we need to have our laws and our statutes on the books upgraded and updated. Yes.
And especially when you speak of the issue of asylum.
Yes.
All right. Now we have a policy document that has been in circulation since 2014, because Trinidad is a party of the 1951 Convention in relation to the status of refugees. We signed that by a cabinet minute in 1979, all right? So the cabinet decision, minute 4809, dated in November 16th of 1979, agreed that requests for the granting of refugee status on political and economic grounds will continue to be dealt with under the appropriate sections of the immigration laws of Trinidad and Tobago, governing the grant of residency status. So they are saying that they would use the existing framework to try and see how they can deal with the refugees. But back in 1979, we did not have what we have in 2018, 2017.
Right.
All right. Literally, our neighbors, they are in a bit of political and economic
Political,
turmoil.
social, economic crisis.
Correct.
And many of them have been coming to this country.
Correct. So
looking either for a better life and so on. How should we, from a legal framework, how should we be dealing with this situation?
Well, the state has to deal with it because it's affecting the citizens. All right. So, for example, I have an office on Gordon Street, and there are more persons on, say, Gordon and Frederick. That's where Living Waters is there.
Yeah.
And the jail.
Yeah.
There are more persons coming to Living Waters than visiting the remand center in the jail. You know, they literally overflow into the street. So my staff literally said, this is Venezuela Street. We have to rename Gordon Street Venezuela Street. That's the corner of Gordon and Frederick Street. So it is visible that a lot of Venezuelans are claiming asylum because the Living Waters community is the only agency in Trinidad that works with the United Nations High Commission for Refugees. That's their agent. And they are allowed to apply for asylum and refugee status in conjunction with the Ministry of National Security.
And therefore, we're going to go to the news very shortly and come back for a few more minutes, Mr. Masai. But are we in danger of either being sanctioned for anything that we've done, so either by the UN or any other international agency? Well,
they don't normally sanction, but they are very persuasive. Because the United Nations is a global body. It's multinational. We buy into it. We send our diplomats to make representation there. I think there was the big FOPO about 2 weeks ago with the Dominica issue.
Yes.
But
yeah.
the United Nations, it carries a lot of weight. And if I read in the papers this morning where Amnesty International made a statement on the repatriation
there was sort of alleged collusion with the Maduro government.
Right, but and Amnesty International holds no interest in Trinidad per se. Their interest is in the United Nations to make sure that human rights globally is recognized. And if it is that those type of organizations are making pronouncements against us, and I think we have a lot of diplomacy to do.
All right, well, we're going to take a break and we'll continue. And certainly as far as doing diplomacy, we haven't really been doing a fantastic job. The Dominica situation, the decision to abstain from the vote on Jerusalem being declared the capital of Israel, which was proposed by Donald Trump of the United States. A couple of Caribbean countries voted against it. A couple others, including Trinidad and Tobago, chose to abstain. And many people are wondering if Trinidad and Tobago has abdicated any sort of moral responsibility as far as reflecting higher values in the Caribbean. But anyway, when we come back after the news, we'll continue our dialogue on the legality of what is happening with either Venezuelans or others in Trinidad and Tobago.
Good morning. With a news update, I am Anselm Gibbs. Prime Minister Dr. Keith Rowley is expected back in TNT today from the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in London. On Monday, Dr. Rowley sought to explain to the diaspora the government's decision to make a slight adjustment to the exchange rate and not devalue the dollar.
This is not arithmetic. There's much more than 2 and 2 equals 4. Because when it was discussed, if we are suffering a significant shortage of an inflow of foreign currency, devaluing it does not create any more. What it does is significantly increase the cost to the population, runaway inflation, and pressure on the population.
Terrell Mackenzie is charged with shooting with intent against 2 off-duty police officers in Tobago last August. Police say on August 30th, the officers were in Lambo when a man got out of a car, shots were heard, and 1 officer returned fire. The officers were not injured. Mackenzie of Arima also faces gun and ammunition possession charges. In sport, the TNT Cricket Board wants the Police Service's Cybercrime Unit to find the person behind a fake news story online about West Indies wicketkeeper Dinesh Ramden allegedly being arrested in New York. Ramden took to social media to clear his name. Now to the weather forecast. Today you can expect partly cloudy to cloudy conditions with brief showers at times in some areas. Today's high will be 30 degrees Celsius for both Trinidad and Tobago.
Combat the stress of today's busy lifestyles. Use Asylum Fort for all-round good health and balance. Asylum Fort contains power nutrients for that extra energy and vitality, 8 essential amino acids and vitamins. Use Asylum Fort to boost energy, build stamina and strength, improve performance, relieve tiredness and stress, and improve memory and concentration. Asylum Fort is excellent supportive therapy for diabetes and hypertension. Get it now at leading pharmacies nationwide.
Final. It's closing. Yes, it's definitely closing. Fab India Expo at the White Tent opposite Medford gas station, Shogunas. It's definitely closing on Monday, April 30th. Opens daily, 11 a.m. to 9 p.m. All new containers with the latest variety of furniture, handicrafts, garments, footwear, jewelry, and many more from around the world. Food court that no one can resist. Dosa Diner is back. Lots of giveaways, ample parking and comfortable ambience. Get up to 80% off. So make your way on down to Fab India Expo.
Damas y caballeros, lo que van a ver ahora es el mayor espectáculo de magia del planeta. Trucos tan asombrosos que vas a querer que te los explique. Piensa un número. Aquí está. Levanten el telón, prepárense para la Copa Mundial de la FIFA Rusia 2018. Es más que un mundial. Por DirecTV, es magia.
Coming up towards 4 minutes after 7 o'clock in Trinidad and Tobago. Again, we're just adjusting our schedule a little bit to accommodate a few more minutes with Attorney at Law Farai Hove Masaisai to give us some perspective and maybe some recommendations, Mr. Masaisai, as to upgrading our legislation to deal with this situation. You mentioned the policy document of 1979. That's almost 40 years ago. What should we, you were 32 years old, so that was 8 years before you turned up on the face of this earth. What would you recommend based on this particular experience that we're going through right now?
I would recommend, we can't just leave it up to the NGOs, the living water communities in our jurisdiction, to try and deal with these refugees. We need to legislate. We need to turn the policy into legislation, and from legislation we need to actually implement the legislation. We have a hodgepodge of different legislations that persons who are legally aware would be aware. But the refugee, the persons on the street, they will not be aware of what is my constitutional rights, what the Immigration Act says, what treaty have we signed. Put it into one condensed piece of legislation to deal with asylum seekers and persons who are refugees. All right, we have already signed up to the United Nations Convention on Human Rights and that sort of thing. We must comply because we send our diplomats out there. They will be shunned. You know, this is a diplomatic issue. And it's an international issue. So my advice to the government would be to legislate, and not just legislate, implement the legislation. All right? Now, immigration and asylum is a major issue of national security. I would advise that they probably just have a separate ministry to just deal with immigration and asylum seekers. Because if you think Venezuela has probably about 30 million people living in Venezuela, and we are little Trinidad with about 1 million people, you know, 1.5. These persons coming over to Trinidad, they are seeing opportunity in Trinidad because they are fleeing, quote unquote, political and economic persecution. Some of them, they say, when you watch BBC News, they say that the persons are eating from the bins. You know, some people come over, the excuses they give, I'm looking for toilet paper, I'm looking for food for my children, that sort of thing. We need to regulate this thing before it gets out of hand.
And because migration has been going on, as one of our callers said earlier, since Adam was a boy, basically. And that is all the movement of individuals for different reasons, to escape persecution, better economic circumstances, different reasons. We see what's been happening with Greece and other countries,
Indeed.
Turkey and so on, with the migration from North Africa. We see what is happening in other parts of the world where people are fleeing for many different reasons. From your own experience, I don't know how much research you would have been able to do. Is there a country, is there a group of nations that has what you would consider as close to best practice in dealing with immigrants? We had Germany at one time just welcoming Syrians into the country, and there's been a political backlash to that. What is your own perspective?
Well, you said the correct word just now. There's always the political backlash, because persons like the status quo. No one likes change. But leadership must lead in terms of change, all right? Refugee camps are set up for what they say it is, for refugees, all right? And it is to really see if they have genuine refugees fleeing from a persecution, whether it be political, economic, social unrest, or in times of wars in Syria and Lebanon. But you have to have a policy in place and legislation in place to deal with the influx. You can't turn a blind eye from Venezuela. You can't. You just simply cannot turn a blind eye from Venezuela.
And because time is running out, and obviously because there are so many issues, we may have another opportunity to develop it further. What would you say to those who will say, look, it's easy to talk about larger countries, larger land spaces, larger population. We're a tiny nation, and as a result, we should not be expected to provide the same sort of facilities, the same sort of services, the same sort of resources that a larger, better resource nation will be able to provide, even if it is our intention to assist our neighbors.
I wouldn't say that we should not be expected to do it. We have to do it. We weren't forced to sign these treaties. Whoever was the leadership at the day, they signed on to the treaties, and we have to comply with them, or else we must probably leave the United Nations. But you have to comply with the treaties that you have signed. Yes, they are international law, but like the International Labour Organization, the Industrial Court in Trinidad, there's no ILO Act, but the Industrial Court follows the International Labour Organization and what they say. Even they dictate, they put it in their judgments. So if the authorities, the parliamentarians don't act, then the judiciary will have to act, and they will act by the way of common law. Because when persons challenge their detention, or challenge their deportation, or challenge the procedural fairness by which they were deported, then the judges come out and they make pronouncements via the Constitution and that sort of thing, and then you say, well, the judge making law and that sort of thing. But we have to, Trinidad and Tobago, we have to play our role. We may not play a big role like, say, Germany and that sort of thing, but we have to put systems in place to deal with asylum seekers and refugees.
Mr. Masai, thanks very much for taking the time to join us this morning. And indeed, he'll be returning to his offices on Venezuela Street, or maybe it's Caracas Street, I don't know, given the situation. We might make light of it, but for the people involved, it's a very serious situation. For them, for some, it might be life and death. For some, they might be taking advantage of the situation for various reasons. But at the end of the day, we need to have a process in place. We talk plenty around here, but implementation continues to be a problem. We'll take a break and continue here in the second hour of Morning Edition.
Strictly conservative.